It's late November, and by now, virtually every corner of the province has seen the snow fly. That is often the cue for thousands of Canadian seniors to head south for the winter. This year, with COVID-19 spiking across North America, that choice isn't as obvious for everyone, particularly as the border is, at least on paper, closed to all non-essential travel. Let's find out from the following trio, whom, as is our custom, we introduce from furthest away to closest to our studio. And here they are. In Edmonton, Alberta, Tyler Dawson. He's a journalist with the National Post and Post Media. And here in Ontario's capital city, in the Theatre District, lawyer Scott Fairley. He is the first co-chair of the Constitutional Law Practice Group and partner in the Cross-Border Litigation Group at Cambridge LLP. And in the annex, Sara Allin, associate professor at the U of T's Dalla Lana School of Public Health and director of operations at the research center, the North American Observatory on Health Systems and Policies. And it's good to have everybody on our program tonight for a conversation that I know a lot of people over the age of 60 are going to be watching very carefully. Scott, I want to start with you because you recently won a court challenge against the government of Ontario that related to the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. What was the case about and how did it go?
Well, the case went well. As you already know, Steve, the snowbirds were created back in 1993 for, among other reasons, to secure health care benefits for out-of-country travelers. This was their second time in court. The case was launched, an application for judicial review, late last year on the heels of the Ford government's announcement that they were terminating out-of-country health insurance coverage altogether. A previous government attempted to do that back in 1993, and the snowbirds went to court then. The court kind of balked at dealing with the case at the time because they said it was premature, given federal provincial negotiations. The subsequent government of, interestingly, the Conservative government of Mike Harris reinstated the benefits that had been previously in place. And the numbers we're looking at it are $400 a day for inpatient coverage and $50 a day for outpatient coverage. Those numbers have stayed in place since then, over a quarter of a century. And then, somewhat surprisingly, the Ford government said, well, this is, given inflation, what have you, this is a kind of a trivial amount of money with big administrative costs, and so we're cashing in the program altogether. So,
well, let me jump in with a follow-up here, because at this time, of course, the Ford government was turning over every rock in an attempt to save some money, and even though the sums weren't big here, relatively speaking, they did want to save the money. What do you think you argued that the court found persuasive that they forced the government to reinstate the program?
Well, the strict legal argument was that the Ontario Health Insurance Act required the government to enact regulations only in conformity with the Canada Health Act. And the termination of the program violated one of the 4 pillars or 5 pillars of the Canada Health Act, which was essentially the mobility of coverage inside and outside Canada, at least to a level commensurate with what the province would pay if those medical services were rendered inside the country, inside the province.
Right. Portability is one of the 5 key pillars of the plan. Now, Sarah, let me go to you with some follow-up there. Obviously, snowbirds were happy with this decision. Do you think the court decided this correctly?
Yeah, I mean, strictly, the Canada Health Act does have this requirement for portability. So it's not surprising to me that this change that went against that requirement was ruled in the favor of the snowbirds. But that said, the Canada Health Act itself could be, we could scrutinize that more closely, and it has been in the past. And so I'll point out one major commission on the future of healthcare in Canada, which was struck by the Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. So it's not a recent commission, but it still is probably the most thorough investigation of the Canada Health Act and its requirements in our recent history. And that this commission, they spent a year and a half consulting with the public, working with experts, commissioning reports, and they recommended in their final report in 2012 that this portability requirement was fundamentally important for Canadians to be able to travel across the country. So, Canadians' right to work and to travel within Canada and to be protected with in the event of illness needs to be maintained. But they argued that this requirement for health coverage to extend beyond the borders was really questioned in this report. This was based on a review done by Professor Colleen Flood at the University of Ottawa, who's a legal scholar, and she was arguing that this notion of a social program following you when you leave Canada is unusual. We don't expect things like, our education programs to follow us if we travel and spend a few months elsewhere, that we would be entitled to go to school and be reimbursed for any costs. So it's unusual to expect that type of coverage to follow you outside of Canada. And so this was really questioned, whether this component of the Canada Health Act was really good policy in the sense of, we have finite health resources. Should it be covering some of the costs of healthcare incurred outside of Canada, or would it be better spent on improving the quality of care in Canada?
And just to be clear, this was the Royal Commission established under former Saskatchewan Premier Roy Romano's tenure. He became known as the Romano Commission. He's the guy who led that whole procedure. And okay, Tyler, I guess I need you to break the tie here. We have a court case that says the snowbirds deserve coverage even if they go south and leave Canada. You've got Sara saying basically, if they want to go to school in the States, or if their kids go to school in the States, they don't get coverage down there. Why should we cover their health care when they leave the province? Where do you come down on this?
I'm not sure I have a super strong view on it. I think I can understand both sides. At the end of the day, though, people, are sort of responsible for the consequences of their own decisions. So, is this a massive cost to government? No, not in particular. But I certainly can see the argument of people who say, look, you are going out of country. You can, if you are doing that, probably afford your own health insurance. And there's certainly a strong argument, I think, to be made that the government really has no business in providing you health care outside of the country.
Well, let's understand who this might actually cover this year, because obviously this is no ordinary year. By this time, in a normal year, we would have seen, pretty significant exodus of older people from Canada down to wherever they're going, Florida, Arizona, wherever they go at this time of year. What do we know about who's leaving so far this year?
There's basically three groups I would say you can categorize them into. You have the people who are diehard snowbirds who are going to go regardless. In some cases, those are people who don't have winter homes in Canada. You have the people who have already decided that, no, they're not going to go middle of the pandemic, just not safe, they'll stay home. And then you have the group that is, taking a wait and see approach, maybe considering going down in January or something like that instead of prior to Christmas. I think for those people, probably they're looking at the state of affairs and thinking it's less and less likely that they're going to be able to head down south this winter.
Scott, this is a serious question. It's going to sound like a facetious question, but it really is a serious question. If you are a snowbird and you want to go south and you get to the border and they say to you, why are you going south? Should you lie and tell them it's an emergency and I've got to check my property down south?
Steve, I'm not an immigration lawyer or an expert in cross-border security. I don't think that is the right answer for a snowbird.
Because if you don't give that answer, they're going to tell you to turn around and go home. You know that, eh?
Well, and I think that's something which snowbirds are being educated on before they make their travel arrangements. I think, you're right, traveling by car for non-essential travel, that's likely to be the result. I don't know if the situation is the same if you take a plane or what have you.
No, I think a plane you can get away with it.
I'd only counsel anyone who is my client to tell the truth.
Right, which we all do all the time. Exactly. Okay, let's. Let me just read this here. This is the Ontario government apparently accepted the court ruling in your case. They're not appealing it. And so the government is going to honor the ruling. And we got this statement yesterday from the Ontario Ministry of Health about this issue. And I'll just read this out here and get this on the record. The government would like to stress that regardless of the reinstatement of OHIP travelers coverage, it strongly recommends that residents obtain private travel health insurance before traveling outside of Canada for any length of time and not rely solely on OHIP, the Ontario Health Insurance Plan coverage, as it will not cover all medical expenses. As we are living in unprecedented times while fighting COVID-19, at this time, the government and the Chief Medical Officer of Health are also urging all Ontarians to limit trips outside of home and travel to essential purposes only, including to other regions in the province, especially from higher to lower transmission areas. Okay, so that's the official word from the Government of Ontario. I guess, Sarah, let's start with you on this. That's their advice. What do you think of their advice?
I think it's good advice. I mean, the surprising thing for me is that this out-of-country coverage is called that. It's not coverage. It's the amount of cost that it covers is so minimal. It's the Auditor General of Ontario estimated it to be about 5 cents of every dollar spent would have been reimbursed. And most of the time it's reimbursed directly to insurance companies who, people who travel know that they need to purchase private insurance already, especially snowbirds who've been doing this many winters, will know that the cost of care in hospitals or by physicians in the United States is extremely high. This is fairly well known that this coverage program is not that. It's mainly a subsidy of insurance companies, and maybe a third of the reimbursements that are sought are by individuals themselves, and the average claim is about $100 that they get. So this is not a coverage program. I think it's important for the government to be very clear that there is no coverage for people out of country, whether they have this program in place or not.
Scott, I don't want to minimize your legal wizardry in this case, but if the fact is that this out-of-province coverage only covers 5 cents of every dollar, is the victory that you won in court all that significant at the end of the day?
Well, I think it's an important one. Sarah's correct on the essential percentages, but there's a bit of a domino effect here. Snowbirds are by and large older retired people, average age 67, average income $73K a year, and that the majority of that is fixed incomes that are derived from pensions, and pension plans from various employers reacted very negatively to the Ford government's decision and threatened to withdraw their own coverage if the government was folding its tent. So the 5 cents on every dollar is really quite misleading in terms of its practical and symbolic impact. And so in the Snowbird situation, anyone traveling south for prolonged periods of time or abroad for prolonged periods of time, private health insurance is a sine qua non of going anywhere, and that has been a reality in Ontario since the early 1990s. Other elements to consider, though, which makes this non-trivial, is short-term travel. Bicycle ride from Wolf Island in upstate New York, a shopping trip from Windsor to Detroit. Very brief times where you're abroad, where you may not have short-term healthcare coverage or what have you, and that 5% is meaningful. Certainly for the demographic that the Snowbird litigation spoke to. if they're not going to the United States, which is the most expensive healthcare system in the world, and they're going to other places like southern Italy or France, the healthcare systems there are very different. And while I don't have complete facts on point, those healthcare systems cover a lot more at a much more reasonable cost. And in some instances, what the Ontario government did give and has now been forced to give back by the Ontario court system closes the gap not insignificantly.
Okay, let me get a little personal with everybody here. Tyler, I want to start with you on this one. Your age, given the age you are, I'm guessing you got grandparents, yes?
I do, yeah.
You got grandparents who usually go south around this time?
Yes, my mom's grandparents go down to California most years.
Your mom's grandparents or your mom's parents?
Or sorry, my mom's parents.
Your mom's parents. Okay, what ages are they?
They're in their mid-80s.
Mid-80s. So they go to California every year around this time. So have you been discussing with them whether they're going to do that this year?
I haven't, no, but I believe my aunts and uncles have talked to them about it, and they're still in Canada, and I don't believe they have any plans to go. You know, they were down there in the spring and late winter when the pandemic first sort of kicked off. So there was a discussion at that point about whether or not they should, you know, try and get on the next plane back home.
And where's home for them?
They live in Red Deer, Alberta, so sort of right in the middle between Edmonton and Calgary.
Gotcha. And they did come home, and now they have to decide whether or not they want to go to California. Do you know, do they plan to try and make it?
No, I'm quite sure they're planning to stay home this winter.
They're going to spend the whole winter in Red Deer. Bet they're looking forward to that.
I can confirm they are not looking forward to that.
Now, what ultimately was the deciding factor for them not to go?
I believe it was, you know, quite simply the pandemic and the risks of getting sick in the United States versus here. And for them, I think it wasn't worth it.
Okay, Sarah, let me come to you on this next one. You got parents or grandparents who normally go south for the winter?
Yes, my parents spend a couple months every winter in Florida.
They do. Okay, and are they there now?
No,
they are here now
this year. Yeah.
They live in Ontario?
Yes, they live in Toronto.
They do. Okay, and let us into some of their decision-making process right now. What are they thinking?
Yeah, they're thinking that it's a pandemic, that the United States does not have this pandemic under control as much as we do have in Canada. Things are getting worse and not better, and hospitals are going to become overrun. The risk of flying is much greater than it has ever been. They're not willing to take any of those risks. The discussion has not involved at all this notion of out-of-country coverage. It's exclusively the pandemic that is driving this decision.
Understood. What age range roughly are your parents in?
Nearly 70.
Okay. How do I put this? You know, it's not like if you stay in Canada, there's zero risk, right? I mean, there is the risk of COVID here. There's also the risk of, you know, needless to say, slipping on ice or something like that through the winters here. So how have they, you know, they've had to balance, I guess, weigh differing risks. Do you know for sure they're not going to go down there at all?
Yeah, well, they ask me for advice, and I usually will, you know, I usually balance these sort of trade-offs between, you know, well-being and sunshine with the risk and the costs, and so my advice was not to go. It's the health system that we know and trust is here in Toronto. The you know, the hospital capacity has been able to be maintained. We did fairly well the first wave of the pandemic, and we're hopeful that we will here. The United States is out of control in many parts of the country, and it's really worrying, and it's not where you want to be, especially when the risks of getting sick are much higher than in any normal winter. And
how do they feel about spending the entire winter in Canada?
Well, I'll be here with my kids, so that'll be nice for some winter visits in their backyard. So that'll make it a little bit easier.
Do you think the joy of spending all that time with their daughter and grandchildren outweighs the misery of the weather that's coming?
I would say yes.
Okay, let's hope you're right. Good enough. Scott, let me ask you the same question. Either your family, you, any relatives, do you know what the situation is regarding going south?
Um, I have one mother-in-law. She's not. I have never been a snowbird. I am snowbound and enjoy that because I'm an enthusiastic skier. So the border issues or the blockade of the border hasn't been a major concern for me.
How old's your mother-in-law?
She is in her 80s.
In her 80s. Is she going to be mad that you just confessed that to our television audience?
She could be, but
you're willing to live with the risk.
Not be specific.
Yeah, okay, good.
And she's very healthy and youthful, and doesn't betray her age in any respect. She's got at least a couple of decades credit on that score.
Okay, you're back in the good books now. Tell me this: would she normally go south for the winter?
That has not been her pattern, except for designated trips, like 2 or 3 weeks on a tour or something like that. But for the longest time, she did have, with her late husband, a timeshare in South Carolina. And so they would do that. But again, it was only, a couple of weeks in a given year.
Gotcha. Tyler, I wonder if you could, again, we're talking about weighing various risks, the risk of going versus the risk of staying. And, I can imagine some people are sitting there saying, well, if I'm going to be staying indoors in Canada all winter, or I'm basically going to be on my own and minding my own business in South Florida all winter, what's wrong with going down and just spending the time in Florida? What's the answer to that?
Well, I don't think there is anything wrong with it necessarily. I mean, my concern would be the pattern that you do see some years where people go down for a couple months and then come back for Christmas and then go back down for a couple months and then maybe come back for spring break or family day or something like that. So, the transmission rates right now from travelers to the Canadian population seems to be very, very low. But if you do have people coming back and forth, that is where I think there is a little bit more of a public health risk and, also maybe more of a moral hazard. So if people want to go and stay, I mean, they're only really putting themselves at risk. People coming back and forth is maybe a different situation, I would say. Well,
and indeed, Tyler, I guess if you go and then come back, you're supposed to, shelter in place for 2 weeks while you're back here. So that's something people may not want to do. And then again, going down, you're dealing with airports. The flights, they tell us, are safer than ever because they changed all the circulation systems on the airplanes now. So that's supposed to be fine. What do you know, relatively speaking, what the safety of traveling through airports would be for senior citizens right now?
Well, I flew once to visit some friends in Ontario, actually, back in June, I guess it was, confessing that on national television. And, it felt actually quite safe, I would say. There were very few people in the airports. You got a little baggie with hand sanitizer and masks and whatnot. So, I don't think it's all that much riskier than anything else. But of course, if we refer back to the Minister of Health statement about trying to stay at home regardless and avoiding non-essential travel around the province, around cities within the country, in that sense, that maybe breaks the spirit of the guidance from public health officials.
Well, let me put that to Sara, because Tyler just hinted at it in his answer. Never mind the public health aspects of this, but is there an ethical angle to this story? Is there a morality about not traveling? Because, never mind for yourself, but ethically, that's the smarter thing to do vis-a-vis the rest of the population here. What can you tell us on that?
Yeah, I think as we've seen in this pandemic, the way that we're going to succeed and to fight this is through sort of solidarity, through thinking about each other, acting as a community, and sometimes that goes against our own personal best interest, but we do it because we know that it's reduces risks for others. So, for instance, the idea that kids are in school and now we shouldn't be perhaps visiting with my parents inside their homes because they have increased risk through, the cohorts that they are with at school. And so it's not what we would like to do personally, but it's what we think we should do because we don't want to get other people sick who might be higher risk. And the same goes for traveling. So the more crowds there are, and we're part of that. If we're going into the airport, we're going into planes, we're contributing to a crowd where that's how the virus is transmitted. So the more we act in keeping with sort of a solidarity idea, the view that we're looking out for each other, then the more successful we'll be. And that's why the Minister of Health and the Chief Medical Officer are saying, stay put. We want people to stay in their homes because that reduces the risk for everyone.
I hear you, but what about the argument some people might come back with, which is, so few people are flying these days. The airports are basically much emptier than they ever were. The flights are going to be half, if not more, empty. The risk that we're taking or the risk that we're imposing on the rest of society is actually probably historically low right now. What about that argument?
Yeah, it depends how many people think that way, and then they won't be so quiet, and the crowds will increase. So I think we just have to make our own decision for where we're going to be best placed. Is it staying in Toronto in the winter and waiting until it's safer to be in another country, or is it to go and stay somewhere warm where you're not going to go out and socialize, but you can be in a warm place? I mean, these are decisions that everyone's going to have to make for themselves.
Tyler, if you actually want someplace relatively warm and you need to stay in Canada, you got any advice for us?
Yeah, there's a few spots in BC that people do historically go, and you're not going to be, sitting out on the beach, but you could maybe get out on the golf course here and there. Victoria on the Vancouver Island is a popular spot. Osoyoos is another one, sort of south of Kelowna, south of Penticton in the interior of BC. Those are both places that see, sort of in-country migration. And there was some chatter earlier this year about people modifying their plans and heading to a place like Osoyoos instead of down to Phoenix or down to California. So there are options. Pack a jacket nonetheless, but perhaps better than being in Red Deer or Toronto.
So you're in Edmonton right now. What do you think about hanging out in Edmonton for the whole winter?
I'm in the same boat as Scott. I'm a big skier, so it's snowing, and I cannot wait for the ski hills to be open and things like that. So I love winter. So I've no desire to go sit in Phoenix.
Good for you. Okay, Scott, let me get you back in here and again get you to speak to this ethical angle here. As a lawyer, you would care about ethics and the law. Do you think there's an ethical argument to be made that nobody should be going south to the United States for the winter while the governments are urging us to kind of shelter in place and, nip this thing in the bud?
Well, I don't think I think the government statement that you quoted was an accurate and useful one, and I agree with Sarah's observations, but I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all situation. And there's a number of Ontario residents who, for very valid health reasons, need to get themselves away from the harshness and hazards of a Canadian winter. And so for those people, there's little alternative. For those who are just seeking, like playing golf all through the winter, well, that's a different calculation. And I think everyone has to be their own judge of the moral hazard they're undertaking and how it might affect others they care about. And I think that will be reflected in the percentages as between this year and a normal year, and hopefully the normal years will return as to who goes south and who doesn't. And on that score, I think it's important to appreciate, given that the Snowbirds litigation was a bit of a catalyst for this panel, that litigation and the Snowbirds' position on out-of-country coverage is totally uncoupled from the extraordinary impact of COVID-19. There's no relationship between the two whatsoever.
No, I take your point on that, but and in fact, with just a couple of minutes to go here, let me get Sarah to comment on this. If I mean, Scott's quite right. There are people who will have legitimate reasons for going south. Maybe they have respiratory issues. They got to get out of the cold, whatever the reasons are. What if they go to the southern United States and if they contract COVID-19, what complications does that present for them then?
Well, it's similar to how the complications they experience here. So there's, health risks. They'd have to, self-isolate and obviously tell others they've been in contact with to do the same. They may end up in hospital. They may require a ventilator. They may need an ICU bed, and hopefully there will be capacity in the hospitals where they're spending time and for them to be admitted. So all of those things are extremely costly. They will likely have private insurance that would cover the cost of those, but if there are complications, this could lead to a prolonged hospitalization, which in itself poses additional risks. But we know that the cost will be enormous. We know the out of country coverage by the Ontario government will not be helpful at all in covering any of those costs. So I think if people are aware, there's risks, there's significant costs, but the benefits have to outweigh those risks.
And Tyler, can you follow up on that? If you are a Canadian and if you are down south and if, God forbid, you need an ICU bed because you've contracted COVID-19, what are your chances of getting one?
Well, I think it probably depends a little bit where you are. I mean, if for some reason you're a snowbird in, South Dakota, which strikes me as unlikely, you're probably less in luck. But case counts in places like California and Arizona are considerably lower. So, I think that your chances are probably all right of getting one. But at the end of the day, I would prefer to be in Canada with, as Sarah said earlier, the medical system we know and trust, compared to, what a medical system that feels like a Wild West a lot of the time.
Understood. I want to thank the three of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. That's Tyler Dawson, who's with the National Post and Post Media. He was out of Edmonton, Alberta, where the winters, I'm told, are spectacular, even if the hockey team isn't always. Scott Fairley is with... Yeah, you didn't like that little shot, did you? And who am I to talk? I'm sitting here in Toronto. Scott Fairley is with Cambridge LLP. He came to us from the Theatre District of the provincial capital tonight. And Sara Allin is with the U of T's Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation, the Dalla School of Public Health, and she joined us from the Annex in the provincial capital. Regardless of whether any of you can get away for the winter, I hope it's a good one for all of you. And thanks for joining us on TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.